We're talking about South Korea's political development and economic growth. My computer's just not cooperating. Okay, Korea's often been called the miracle on the Han. The Han River runs through Seoul, and today we'll look at how it reached both economic and democratic success. So going by last year's data, it's the 12th largest economy in the world, and as of 2021 was ranked 16th in the world in democratization. And this didn't come easily. It was achieved through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears by many people. Okay. So just a little bit about the 20th century. So the Joseon dynasty ended in 1910. Korea was under Japanese colonial rule from 1910 to 1945. And after the end of World War II, it was jointly occupied by the Soviets in the north and the Americans in the south. And the Soviets and the Americans pulled out between 1947 and 1948 when the two separate governments of the Republic of Korea in the south and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was formed in the north. The two Koreas were in a civil war from 1950 to 1953. I have an asterisk there, however, because the Civil War, the Korean War actually never ended. It's still going on now. The two Koreas are still at war. 1953 was an armistice treaty. And throughout the Cold War, South Korea underwent rapid economic growth until the moment of democratization in 1987. One of the ways we can see South Korea's economic growth is through Chung Hee. It is a stream that ran through Korea for about 5 miles and through Seoul, downtown Seoul. And in 1958, they covered it over in concrete, became an elevated roadway in 1976. And in 2003, then Mayor Lee Myung-bak announced a restoration project and it opened to the public. And today it's not a natural stream anymore. It's actually Han River water that's pumped in and then goes back out to the Han River. But you can see the picture. So on one part of Cheonggyecheon, in the 50s, you see really just very dilapidated, very temporary looking homes on stilts. And then they drained the stream. And part of the stream had much nicer houses. Some of these houses go back to 1394 when Seoul became the capital of Joseon. Here you see kids playing, you see the pilings going up, you see the pilings going up for the elevated roadway, and this is how it looked like after it opened. So this is from the late 1970s onward, it looked like that. And you can see also how it looked like during the construction and then how now it is a nice downtown park and it looks like this. So I think this really illustrates South Korea, how it went through rapid economic development and also now is really focused on other things like quality of life here. Okay. So this is an economic timeline. I'll be talking about some of these things. I actually wrote this up for the Korean Consulate General. I'm not sure what website it's on, but I can certainly make it available to NKSS for your website. I have, in addition to the PowerPoint, I have a short reading with a quiz that you can give to your students if you choose to use this. Okay, and this is the democratization timeline. I'm not going to go through the timeline because I'll be talking about that here. Okay, so the Korea had been one single Korea for many, many years, going back to the current borders go back to Joseon. However, even before that, there was a single Korea all the way from about the time of the Goryeo dynasty in the 10th century. So Korea became divided in 1945. Two separate governments were established in 1948. And Syngman Rhee was the first president of the Republic of Korea, or South Korea. He was elected 4 times total, exceeding term limits. And the government under Syngman Rhee is known as the First Republic. That's the first constitution in the Republic of Korea. And then the Korean War was from 1950 to 1953. And this was a time, especially after the Korean War, where there was a lot of economic difficulties in South Korea. The focus was on import substitution because they were importing so many goods that they were trying to promote a local economy. Syngman Rhee also instituted the national security law, which was a very vague definition of sedition, or what it means to go against the government. In April 1960, there was a student revolution that ousted Syngman Rhee. He resigned and lived in exile in Hawaii, and then there was a brief period of democracy. Let's talk a little bit more about the Korean War. So even before the start of the Korean War on June 25th, 1950, there were guerrilla fighters in the Southwest. They didn't have any ties to North Korea or the Soviet Union. There were numerous attacks on both sides of the 38th parallel. So back then, it wasn't the DMZ dividing the two, it was the 38th parallel. But in the night of June 24th, going into June 25th, North Korean troops crossed into South Korea. And in North Korea, they say that South Korea invaded first. However, that is not factually correct. Okay, so here's a brief timeline of the war. The main things are in bold. So war broke out, and the North Korean troops quickly took control over much of the peninsula. That changed on September 15th when MacArthur landed at Incheon, and then the tides changed. And let me show you the map. That's actually easier to see. So this is where the 38th parallel divided the two Koreas. North Korea invaded on June 25th. By September 14th, the South Korean and Allied troops are just in what's called the Busan perimeter. However, when MacArthur landed here at Incheon, and the South Korean and UN troops were able to cross the 38th parallel and in fact have most of the peninsula. However, at that point, Chinese troops joined the North Koreans, and after the armistice, the dividing line between the two Koreas was at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, rather than the 38th parallel. So this is a picture of Seoul. It was the wartime devastation was terrible on both sides. And so the Korean War can be seen as a civil war because it was the two Koreas fighting each other. It was also a proxy war between the US and the USSR. It was also an international war in that it was, in addition to the two Koreas, 23 other countries were involved. These are very rough numbers, but the loss of lives and injuries, people uprooted, families being divided, was really devastating. And many people longed for unity. And then the Cold War really cemented the division between the two. This is the student revolution from 1960. And that's Syngman Rhee and his wife, Francesca, and their dog leaving for Hawaii. So there was a brief period of democratization. People were hoping for democracy. So they wrote a whole new constitution, and Korea, this period is known as the Second Republic. Chang became prime minister, and the president was more of a figurehead. It was the prime minister who had the real power. They also had, for the first time, direct elections for the provincial governors, mayor of Seoul, but there was a lot of insecurity, and some people were critical that the government was weak. And that's Chang Myon. He had studied in America. He was also known as John Chang. He was prime minister. And then Park Chung-hee staged a coup on May 16th, 1961. And Chang Myon, the prime minister, asked for U.S. assistance, but the U.S. declined to intervene. The emphasis at this time was on anti-communism and the Cold War. So rather than promoting full democratization in South Korea, the emphasis was on anti-communism and having a strong ally against communism in the South. So Park Chung-hee ruled originally through a junta, and then in 1963, under the advice of then President John F. Kennedy, he ran for election and he won in 63, 67, and 71. And in 72, you see that marked with an asterisk, he actually wrote a whole new constitution that was called the Fourth Republic, and he basically changed it so that the president had a 6-year term, and the president, instead of having direct elections, the sitting president oversaw an electoral body which then voted for the president. So in essence, Park Chung-hee became president for life, and in 1979 he was assassinated. So that is Park Chung-hee. Now, although he had taken control in a coup, many people still today really admire Park Chung-hee as a very strong leader who put economic development above all else. So the central government, through an economic planning board, had these 5-year development plans. And in 1965, South Korea and Japan normalized relations. And this meant resumption of diplomatic ties between the two countries, and this brought in $800 million in aid and loans for South Korea. The year after that was a agreement called the Brown Memorandum, and over the course of the Vietnam War, 300,000 South Korean soldiers went to fight in the Vietnam War. South Korean companies also became key suppliers in the war effort, and this brought in about $1 billion in US aid to South Korea. So between these two, South Korea got a big economic boost in order to develop economically. This is the signing of the 1965 Normalization Treaty between Korea and Japan. These are some Korean soldiers in the Vietnam War. And so during Park Chung-hee, instead of import substitution as under Syngman Rhee, they pursued an export-oriented industrialization and building up a lot of technology. So this is when Park Chung-hee really came up with some really ambitious plans, like POSCO, the Pohang Iron and Steel Company, Hyundai Shipbuilding, at a time where Korea was still economically really struggling. It was really amazing for the government to be talking about becoming a major shipbuilder, for example. Also, in South Korea, they took advantage of a lot of cheap labor. And so there are many goods being produced in Korea for export. So many clothes were being made in the Pyeonghwa market. The Kuro Industrial Complex also made a lot of goods for export. And Park Chung-hee also focused on Semaul, or the New Village Movement, which is a rural revitalization campaign. And all of this was during the Cold War. So really the emphasis was on a strong anti-communist stance. So this is the Pyeonghwa market, where many young people, many especially young women, were involved in making clothes. And this is Pohang Iron and Steel, today one of the largest steel makers in the world. Also, Hyundai Shipbuilding. Now, Korea, depending on how the data is calculated, is generally the first or the second largest shipbuilder in the world. So if you go by gross tonnage, it's generally the largest. These are pictures of the countryside where Park Chung-hee helped people build stronger houses. And then after Park Chung-hee's assassination in 1979, there was another brief attempt at democratization. And then there was a second coup, this one by Chun Doo-hwan in May 1980. And I'll talk a little bit about these things here. Whoops, okay, actually, we've got pictures. Okay, I'm going to come back to those slides. Let's go kind of more chronologically. Okay, so with the Gwangju democratization movement of 1980, it started with a small-scale protest at Jeonnam National University in the city of Gwangju. And This was said to be a North Korean communist plot. And so paratroopers were sent in, and there was massive violence against civilians. And about 230 civilians were killed. And citizens managed to, a few days later, commandeer the city, and they requested U.S. help. But again, the U.S. declined to intervene, saying that this was a local matter. And this led to anti-Americanism later. So the military went, during the time when the citizens were in control of the city, the military had blockaded the city. The military moved back in and put down the protesters. Okay, so this is a picture of the main square in Gwangju. You see the citizens there. And if you're interested in this, there's a film which I wouldn't have showed to students, but for you, you might be interested in watching this film called A Taxi Driver. And if the actor looks familiar, that is Song Kang-ho, who was in Parasite. Okay, so after 1980, the democratization movement picked up new steam, and students, intellectuals, and workers together really united with the help of many different religious groups. The middle class joined in, women's groups. And so in 1987, they achieved democratization and had the first direct elections since actually, not 1972 was not direct election, so 1971. And there was increased civil rights at the time. These are students in the democratization movement. You can see the scale of people's enthusiasm to vote in the first direct election since 1971. This is Yeouido Plaza. You see the number of people out there. I think somebody's in the waiting room. Okay, and then in the 1987 election, Roh Tae-woo won the election. Now there were, it was a four-way, there were four candidates, and so Roh Tae-woo won without a majority because there were so many people in the race. And this is considered the moment of democratization in 1987. However, it really was a process. And with the 1988 Seoul Olympics ahead, there was more emphasis on people's civil rights, human rights. And then after Roh Tae-woo was Kim Young-sam. Kim Young-sam became president. He had been one of the people who ran in 1987. He won in 1992 and became president in 1993. And during Kim Young-sam's presidency, I'm sorry, that's a typo. It should be trials, not trails. So former presidents Chun and Roh were put on trial, and South Korea joined the OECD in 1996. So South Korea went from being a recipient to a donor and then a major donor in the OECD. And at the end of Kim Young-sam's presidency, Korea entered the Asian financial crisis hit Korea. In Korea, it's also known as the IMF crisis. Okay. And then in 1997, Kim Dae-jung became president. He'd also been one of the people who ran in 1987 and won in 1997. He was a longtime opposition leader, and he had been arrested many times, given multiple death sentences. And his winning of the election also was really important in that he was the first candidate from the Jeolla province to win, and it showed that South Korea was breaking the old regional discrimination, and this is generally considered the moment of full democratization in Korea. So coming at the end of the Asian financial crisis, or coming at the beginning of the Asian financial crisis, Kim Dae-jung's initial concern was economic recovery. And then he turned to the Sunshine Policy, which is the name of the policy of engagement with North Korea. And in 2000 was the first North-South Summit. And for that, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And there he is. He traveled to Pyongyang, became the first South Korean president to go to Pyongyang, meet with his counterpart, that is Kim Jong-il. And after that, Roh Moo-hyun became president. He was a self-educated lawyer, so he didn't go to law school. He had studied and passed the bar on his own. He was impeached in 2004 by the National Assembly for illegal electioneering and incompetence. This was overturned by the Constitutional Court. He had a second North-South summit, and after his presidency, he committed suicide. There he is. You might also notice that Kim Jong-un here looks much weaker than he did in the 2000 summit. Okay, and then Lee Myung-bak became president in 2008. If his name is familiar, I also talked about him in the context of Cheonggyecheon when he was mayor of Seoul. So he was a former business person, former member of the National Assembly, former mayor of Seoul, and he is credited with Korea being very early to recover from the worldwide recession. They called him the CEO president. There are also a large-scale beef protests against the resumption of U.S. beef imports, more tensions with North Korea. So there he is sitting in the Cheonggyecheon stream, these were what's known as the beef protests. You might remember mad cow disease, and so South Korea had stopped importing U.S. beef, and then there were many protests when he announced the resumption of beef imports without restrictions, and then that led to changes where in South Korea they said, or the U.S. agreed to only export beef of the same quality as sold in the United States. Okay, so after that was Park Geun-hye's presidency, and she was known as South Korea's Iron Lady. People compared her to Margaret Thatcher, and under her presidency, we saw more conflict with North Korea. The Kaesong Industrial Complex closed. This has been opened as part of the Sunshine Policy. The Sewol Ferry, carrying many middle schoolers, sank. And then there was also a scandal involving her longtime confidant who had been advising her and also had coerced a lot of donations on Park Geun-hye's behalf. And she was impeached and removed and imprisoned. She has been released. This is a memorial for the Sewol Ferry victims. And this shows some of the difficulties of being a president or former president. Sorry, I'm having problems with my contact lens. Okay. So Moon Jae-in was president after Park Geun-hye, after she was removed from office. And he had 3 summits with North Korea in 2018. And relations with the U.S. became a little bit more fraught. That the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System was deployed, and South Korea bought more U.S. military equipment and also expanded Camp Humphreys at the cost of about $10 billion, nearly all of it paid for by South Korea, and it is the largest overseas U.S. base. And there are more tense relations with both China and Japan, with China over THAAD, and trade tensions also with Japan. And Moon Jae-in's presidency was also credited with initial COVID success in South Korea. So there we see him with Kim Jong-un and also with then President Donald Trump. So if we look at COVID in June 2021, South Korea seemed to be doing remarkably well. There were very few cases there. Students went to school. You see people are masking up. You see the partitions there. You see they were doing massive electronic tracking of people, but also cleaning, disinfecting like that. So this is from as of May 31st of this year, given that Korea has a population, South Korea has a population of about 52 million. This was a lot of confirmed cases. It's higher. I haven't had a chance to update it. So as of May 31st, there were many cases. And right now it's also been rising up. However, for the majority of people, it's quite mild. So in South Korea, they call it living with COVID. In the US, for the same amount of time, we also see the number of cumulative cases and deaths as of May 31st. And in Korea, again, there was massive testing and also masking. And Yoon Suk-yeol is the current president, became president last year, and he won by less than, I'm sorry, not, so the total, so his lead over the next candidate was less than 1% of the total vote. He had some very interesting campaign pledges. He made the Blue House the official president's residence, the People's House. So he moved and then he opened it to the public. He said he would abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, MOJAF. That hasn't happened yet. And here you can see the exit poll results. So for young men under 30, they went predominantly for, they voted for President Yoon. For women under 30, they went largely for the Liberal Party. And you see also the changes by age. Okay, so today, South Korea's economic strengths are in the automobile industry. Perhaps some of you have a Hyundai or a Kia, or perhaps you know somebody who has a Hyundai or a Kia. Shipbuilding, and semiconductors. In fact, many, perhaps you have a Samsung or an LG phone, or even if you have an Apple phone, the chips in there may be Korean chips. Also, you probably have heard of Korean pop culture, especially K-pop and films and K-dramas recently. So the economic growth happened starting in the 1980s in terms of construction. Starting in the 1980s, Korean companies took on a lot of projects in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. 1990s, the focus was on high-tech industries. And since 2000, the Korean Wave, as well as electronics, cars, and ships have become very big. Okay, so this is a Hyundai vehicle. I was in Korea over the winter. I rented one of these and I was amazed. I definitely would, if I'm getting an electric car, I would get the Hyundai Evoque. I talked about the Korean shipbuilding industry. Now, one of the reasons that it's also really been growing even more since the pandemic began is that South Korean shipbuilding is really focused on green energy. So using cleaner burning energy. You see that here. And if we look at the Korean economy, you see that it's been growing. Of course, during COVID, I think many of the world's economies did shrink. Here you see exports and imports. 2022, it was hitting a big high. However, there's now a trade imbalance. Or from 2022, there's been a trade deficit. You see also Korean exports here from 2021 and how it grew. Okay, and let's talk about Korean popular culture. You probably heard of BTS, perhaps you know other big K-pop bands as well, perhaps Blackpink. You may have watched Squid Game. They are, ramping up for a Squid Game season 2. Parasite, won the Oscars for Best Film, and soft power in general has been really big. So this is BTS. They're kind of working individually right now as they have entered and will be, the remaining members will be entering their mandatory military service. Squid Game, Parasite. Also, well, Yoon Ye-jung was not in Parasite, but she won for Minari, which is an American film. However, it was classified as a foreign film because of the amount of foreign Korean language spoken. And it's not just BTS. This is might look like a concert, but this is actually a video game tournament. Koreans are some of the best gamers in the world, and there's a huge pro gaming industry in Korea. If you look at streets in Seoul, it looks very much like Rodeo Drive here or any other major shopping destination. This is one of my favorite things. This is not a giant fish tank. It's actually a giant digital screen. And here they have it looking like a fish tank. So if we look at the past and the future of Korea, there have been many economic and democratic, it is an economic and democratic powerhouse today, but this didn't come easily. It came at the struggles of many students, labor groups, and others in civil society. And due to Cold War tensions, the focus really was not on democratization for much of the Cold War until 1980s. Looking to the future, I think Korea could certainly be more inclusive and equitable, although there are also fun shows and movies like Parasite and Squid Game, they may also indicate that Korea, it's a tough place to be successful. And also, I think that's why those two really resonated with global audiences. So certainly, South Korea showed itself as a leader in global health and climate change, and I think will continue to do so in the future. Picture of labor groups. Now, like if you saw Squid Game, you saw Ali, the character in there. Korea does have many guest workers. They've also been demanding better rights, labor rights. There are also in Korea many women who go for marriage migration, who marry Korean men. This is a multicultural day at an elementary school, and you see the different ethnicities represented. And many people also go to Korea to teach English. There are also many people who go to Korea as international students. In the old days, it used to be generally Korean, ethnic Korean students, but today it's very popular amongst, people from all over. And also many people go not to just learn about Korea, but to learn things like engineering, major in engineering and other fields in Korea. In terms of popular culture, this was a very popular novel, Kim Ji-young, born 1982. It's been translated into many different languages. It also became a film. If the actor on the left is familiar, he was the dad in Train to Busan. This was very popular because it also highlighted the many ways in which women experience gender discrimination through their lives. So overview, Korea, we talked about it being the miracle on the Han. We saw how Korea reached economic and democratic success, 12th largest economy in the world, 16th in democratization, and how this really came through a lot of effort by people, workers, the public, the civil society, and that there's a really exciting future ahead for South Korea.